The lid didn't rise so much as groan, iron against concrete rust breaking like old bread. I leaned over the ring of the cistern while the wind pressed heat into my coat, and the first thing I saw was fabric the color of washed-out sky wedged against pipework hairs, snagged along a joint like cobwebs. The second thing was bone, a tiny arch of teeth still set. The smell that came up wasn't death, not exactly. It was wet limestone and years of silence, as if the earth had been breathing shallow and finally exhaled. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. On paper, I live in Austin now, a 2-bedroom condo near the Greenbelt where the cicadas can outshout a patrol helicopter on a hot night. Most mornings, I run the trail before the sun gets mean, shower quick pour coffee, then drive south with the radio low and the air vents full bore because the dash reads 92 degrees by 9. That was my rhythm before March reports interviews. Pawn shop checks, the steady scrape of old cases I try to lift back into the light. Nothing dramatic, just the bright hum of fluorescence at a shared desk and stale donuts if the rookies hadn't found them first. Split Creek is 53 miles off my route, but its voice never left me. A ranch town where fences wear the same wire from the Carter era, and folks still leave melons on tailgates with a coffee can for the cash. The roads run narrow and straight until they don't, and the mesquite turns the wind into a rasp that sounds like chatter from another room. Summers there bake you from the top down. Heat carries the scent of diesel and alfalfa, and the shade under a cottonwood is worth more than dollars people will admit. I grew up 10 miles outside of it, where our mailbox rattled if a truck hit the washboard right and the porch light burned longer than my mother ever meant it to. The Carter's farm sits at the end of a county lane that kinks left around a dry creek and then straightens for a quarter mile. If you're driving at dusk, the barn comes up purple first, then red, then brown. The boards have been replaced in patches through the years like a quilt nobody matched the fabric for. The house itself wore white paint in the 80s, the kind that flakes even when you show it love. Back then, a screened door snapped like a metronome, and Bertie's radio kept a country station low in the kitchen. She had a habit of humming when she cooked real humming, not the idea of it, and a wooden spoon with a groove worn deep enough to cradle a line of bacon grease like a riverbed. Saturdays in Split Creek followed a kind of clock that didn't need hands. Mornings belonged to chores and the feed store. Lunch meant sandwiches on paper plates and a boxed fan pushing air through a warm room. Afternoon was errands if the truck cooperated, then iced tea in glasses you had to hold with 2 fingers because the sweating made them slick. Evening was hoses and sprinklers, the smell of wet dust, and the slow cooling when the sky softened from white to pink like somebody drew a curtain over the day. I knew Bertie by her church pie and the way she pinched my cheek when I held the door. She kept her silver hair twisted up with 2 bobby pins like she could pull them and let the past spill down her shoulders. She spoke in sentences that always had a warning tucked somewhere in the middle. Not bossy, just careful. Don't run barefoot near the fence line, sugar, the ground bites back, she'd say. And you believed her because she seemed to listen to the soil as much as to folks. The fact that she kept a tidy garden in the ugliest heat any of us remembered made you think she had a private arrangement with the land. Samuel was a different kind of quiet. I remember him behind the wheel of a Ford with the seat adjusted so far back his knuckles brushed the door. He was the man who fixed without telling anyone he'd begun the kind you'd see up on a ladder past dark because a hinge didn't feel right in his hand. He nodded more than he talked. When he did speak, it came out soft and low, and you had to lean in. If he shook your hand, he looked at your shoulder, not your eyes. People said he had been a fair man before a stroke in '91 took him quickly, and that was the end of most conversations about him. In these parts, dying saves you from being explained. That summer, the one before the town's calendar split down the middle, ran hot even for July. My father spent evenings in the survey trailer off County Road 11, rolling maps over the table and weighing their corners with whatever he had, a chalk line, a crescent wrench, a jar of river stones he kept because he liked the way they felt cool in the palm. He'd come home with dust like flour on his boots and a slip of paper in his shirt pocket where he wrote things he didn't want to trust to memory. If you asked him about permits, he'd say the same line he always had. Out here a man signs, and it's the same as a handshake. I believed that for a long time. I was 10 in '83, old enough to ride my bike into town for a grape snow cone and a look through the window of the hardware store where they displayed chainsaws like trophies. The Carter kids came through the square the same days I did. Casey had a way of walking ahead and then waiting at the corner for the rest. Annie would hang back watching the ground for treasure like little sparks, a bottle cap, a nail that still had a straight bit of marble left in the dust. Benji carried a piece of slingshot rubber in his pocket like it was a rabbit's foot. Darla wore braids she did herself loose enough to come apart by supper if somebody didn't fix them. Caleb held a blue stuffed dog like it was part of his body. When the sun lit that dog just right, the fabric shone like something you could call sky. The farm had rules like any place trying to put order on 1,000 living, moving things. Don't harass the hens. Don't turn a faucet and walk away. Don't climb the hay bales when nobody's looking. And don't go near the old cistern, not even to look. The lid sat flush to the ground under a tangle of weeds near the southeast corner of the barn. It was big as a truck tire and twice as stubborn. In daylight, it just looked like a circle of iron too heavy to lift. At night, it turned into a darker hole inside the dark. We'd dare each other to touch it, and then laugh too loud after like noise could fluster fear. My mother stocked Kleenex and aspirin like we were always going to be on the edge of a flu even in summer. She measured days in chores and meals, and the nearest thing to sin in her book was a sink full of dishes left to soak. She kept the porch light on longer than necessary when we were out, and longer still when we were home. A habit she said was for company, but I think was for herself. Light stands guard over nothing, as well as it does over something. In Split Creek, the sheriff's car eased through town with windows rolled down. Sheriff Halpern preferred the sound of the street to the radio. If you waved, he tipped a hand off the wheel. The radio station out of Lockhart dropped between songs if a cloud parked wrong over the tower. Folks didn't mind. That pause was how you heard the crickets, and we trusted the crickets to tell us if everything was right. When they droned, we slept easy. When they cut off all at once, people stepped out on porches and scanned the tree line without knowing why. The week before the day I'm leading you toward, I visited the Carters with my father. He needed to look at fence stakes along the back pasture where the creek bends if you draw it on a map rather than walk it. Bertie handed me a glass of tea and tapped a spoon against the rim like she was tuning an instrument. "Stay where I can see you," she told the cousins. No bite in it, just a practiced hope. The kids spilled into the light anyway, bare feet slapping boards, the screen door clapping behind them. Samuel's boots were lined up by the back step, dusty toes pointed toward the field like they were ready to go on without him. There are small noises I remember from that summer clearer than any words, the soft click of a jar lid on and off. Wind lifting the corner of a feed sack. A fan motor that stuttered on startup and then settled into a long breath. Once late on a Thursday, our phone rang and hung up before anyone could catch it. My mother looked at the clock and said the name of a neighbor's boy as if thinking it might be him. She left the receiver on the counter instead of setting it back in the cradle. For no reason I can explain, that made the kitchen feel tilted. Split Creek had a carnival the second week of July. Not the bright kind that comes with glossy posters, but a small run of rides and fried things, lights strung from poles, a ticket booth where the teenager took bills with ink on his fingers. People said it was decent enough. The Ferris wheel squealed, and the man in charge had a cigarette that burned all the way down without him taking a second drag. He fixed a sign with tape that didn't want to stick, slapped the side of the booth, and told my friend they closed early if the wind shifted. The wind did shift that night. It blew in warm from the south, and the flags along the square went limp as wet laundry. That was the kind of nothing we noticed a flag that lay down instead of lifting. On Saturdays, time collects in kitchens, even if nobody plans it that way. That weekend, Bertie worked the stove like it owed her money, and she meant to be polite about collecting. The smell of bacon hung deep and sweet. She called names in a sequence she'd called 100 times. Casey first because he ran fastest, Annie because she drifted Benji because he forgot to come in when he was in the middle of building anything, Darla because she tried not to be trouble, and Caleb because at 5 you can't carry your own name far. Her voice floated across the yard and broke on the barn wall, slid over the cistern lid, and out toward the pasture's fence where the grass thinned and turned to dirt. On the morning I'm thinking of, the sky went white, early, the kind of color that makes you squint even in the shade. You could hear grasshoppers in the ditch like rain that never lands. Our dog lay stretched under the Buick and didn't shift when I walked by. When heat sits up on its elbows that way, people say the day's going to be a bear, and they mean you'll sweat and get slow and the cool won't find you even if you go looking. My father left a note on the counter about an afternoon drive to the north side easement. He wrote back by 1:30, underlined once, like he knew my mother wanted times even when the world rarely honored them. He had a file folder sticking out of his work bag that said Carter South Line on its tab. I didn't read it then. I didn't read most of his tabs. That afternoon, he wore the green cap with the oil company logo a stranger had handed him at the courthouse years earlier. He never threw away a hat that fit. I biked into town for a bottle of Dr. Pepper and sat on the edge of the hardware store porch watching a truck idle at the light. Heat shimmered off the blacktop in gentle waves, a ripple that makes distance look like water if you don't blink. Casey and the others had passed earlier, a quick blur of sunburn and noise, and the blue dog hung off Caleb's elbow like he'd won it in a coin toss. When I finished the bottle, I put it back in the crate outside the door because Mrs. Flores saved glass, and everyone knew better than to toss it in the bin by the postbox. By noon, the sound of the crickets came up louder than they should, drowning the faraway whine of a tractor's belt. The radio cut out for a minute and came back with an ad for a feed supplement that made old cows show like champions. The square looked like it always did. Mailboxes stood. Flags drooped. Someone hosed off the sidewalk in front of the diner, and steam rose from concrete like a ghost catching its breath. At the Carter place, the porch fan clicked every 6th spin. Inside, the oven door squeaked when it opened and sighed when it closed. Bertie set out 6 plates and then, without a blink, fetched a 7th and slid it to the end because hospitality is a reflex that works faster than numbers. She had a stack of folded napkins with the corners pressed sharp as playing cards. The table looked like duty and love tied the knot. I stood with my father by the truck at the lane's end, dust lifting in curls around the tires like it wanted a ride. He squinted toward the house. I checked my watch and held my breath without meaning to. The air had gone still enough to hear the distant rattle of a screen door. A sound tried to reach us and didn't. We waited for a piece of the day that normally arrived on cue, the slap of small feet on steps, the chorus of "We're coming," the quick slam of that door. It didn't come. The porch light ticked once as if deciding something. The minute hand on my watch crawled past 12. The phone in our kitchen 10 miles away sat with its receiver just off the cradle where my mother had set it the night before. And the road to the house held no dust at all. The silence that afternoon didn't feel like quiet. It felt like something had stepped into the room and taken all the air with it. I remember standing beside my father's truck, waiting for the noise that usually carried from the Carter Place screen door, children's voices, the call of one name after another. But all I could hear was the low drone of insects and the slow ticking of metal as the heat worked through it. My father shaded his eyes and said, "They must have gone down by the creek like it was nothing," and then we climbed into the cab. That was the last normal sentence spoken in Split Creek for a long time. By the time we got home, the phone was ringing off the hook. My mother's hand covered the receiver and she whispered that Bertie couldn't find the kids. 5 of them. Gone before lunch. The next hour turned into a blur of engines, barking dogs, and neighbors throwing on boots. I drove back toward the Carter farm before I even thought about it. The sun hung high enough to burn the edge of the sky white, and the dust on the road stood so thick it looked like smoke. When I turned onto the lane, Sheriff Halpern's cruiser was already parked crooked near the porch. He stood beside Bertie, hat off, trying to keep his tone steady while she clutched her apron with both hands. She kept saying they were just playing, just running by the fence as if repeating it might bring them back. Every few minutes she'd look past him toward the pasture like she expected to see 5 silhouettes running home through the heat. The dogs whined and pawed at the dry ground near the barn, noses pressed low tails stiff. Halpern was a man who'd seen his share of bad days, but even he looked uneasy. Sweat darkened his collar and his voice stayed soft, almost apologetic when he called for the first line of volunteers to spread out. We combed that property until the light began to slide, checking every outbuilding, every hollow, the edges of the creek bed where reeds stood, shoulder high and brittle. My father joined a line that pushed through the brush on the far side of the field, and I stayed close to the barn circling the old cistern, where a few weeds had managed to survive the drought. Its iron lid sat sealed and sun-bleached the weld lines so tight they looked like scars. I remember tapping it once with my boot, not out of suspicion, just habit, and feeling the vibration hum longer than it should have. When the search dragged into evening, the sheriff called for lanterns and generators. From a distance, the field looked dotted with fireflies, little pools of yellow light moving slow and uncertain. Bertie stayed on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, even though the air was still warm. Someone brought her water she didn't drink. Someone else suggested checking the carnival that had packed up 2 nights before, but Halpern dismissed it too far too quick, no sign of a vehicle leaving. Around midnight, a deputy carried up something small, a stuffed blue dog with 1 ear missing. Caleb's. I saw the color drain from Bertie's face, her lips parting like she might speak, but nothing came out. The sheriff placed the toy in an evidence bag and sealed it with tape that crackled too loud in the quiet. By dawn, news trucks had started to arrive. Split Creek wasn't the kind of place that saw camera crews, but that week they came in pairs setting up by the fence line, calling across the yard for statements nobody had the strength to give. Volunteers kept arriving from nearby towns. The Red Cross brought coffee, the local diner sent boxes of sandwiches. People wanted to help because that's what you do when something impossible lands in your backyard. You try to fill the space with movement. I spent most of that morning near the barn again, talking to a field hand named Rowdy Gaines who'd been working there the day before. He said he'd seen the children running toward the back fence around 9:30, laughing like they was chasing a ghost. He'd wiped his brow and gone back to work, never thinking to follow. He said it 3 different times as though saying it the same way would make it make sense. By the 3rd day, Split Creek felt like it was shrinking. People kept their porch lights burning through the night, and the grocery clerk started locking the doors before sunset. The sheriff expanded the search perimeter, brought in divers for the creek even though the water barely reached a man's knees. Every direction led nowhere. My father spent nights at the command post cross-checking survey maps to mark wells pits, old cellars, any hole deep enough to hide something. I'd sit on the tailgate beside him reading coordinates out loud while the radio cracked with static and the hum of diesel generators filled the background. Around the 4th night, he told me quietly, "Sometimes the ground keeps secrets better than people." I didn't know what he meant then, not really. The 5th morning, Halpern held a press briefing at the edge of the property. He stood behind a folding table, eyes red from lack of sleep. "No sign of abduction," he said, reading from a slip of paper. "No ransom demand, no evidence of foul play." Then he looked up and said, "But we're not stopping." His voice cracked on that last part, and the crowd murmured, unsure whether to believe him or pity him. When it ended, I caught a glimpse of Bertie standing alone by the porch steps, arms wrapped tight around herself. Behind her, the farmhouse windows reflected the sky, blank and empty. I thought about how many meals she'd cooked for those kids, how she'd probably set plates out that very morning before everything went sideways. Weeks passed. The field dried out. Reporters left for newer tragedies. By September, the reward money had gone unclaimed, the leads had turned to dust, and the sheriff retired quietly without ceremony. The case box was labeled and shelved. Bertie refused to leave the farm even after her sons moved away. She told my mother once that the land was still holding them somehow. She'd sweep the porch, hang fresh laundry, keep the place neat like they might come running in at any minute. I'd drive past sometimes on my way to field work with the department, and from the road, you could still see her silhouette in the rocker motion, steady as a heartbeat. Years folded over themselves. I joined the county sheriff's office, then the state task force. Life turned into paperwork arrests, the usual rhythm of a career that's half patience and half stubbornness. The Carter case sat buried in the archives, one of those names people muttered like a cautionary tale. By the time Bertie turned 90, most of Split Creek had changed hands. New roofs, new mailboxes, but that farm stayed the same. Then, early this year, I got a call from dispatch asking if I still had family ties to the area. A plumber working on the property had reported something strange. When I pulled up that afternoon, the sun was just starting to drop behind the tree line. A backhoe stood beside the barn, its arm frozen mid-lift. The air smelled like wet earth and something metallic. Crime scene tape fluttered across the yard, the kind of sight that makes you forget to breathe for a second. Sheriff Hargrove met me halfway up the path, gray now glasses fogged from the humidity. "You'll want to see this," he said quietly. The plumber, Jacob Trillo, stood off to the side, pale and fidgeting, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He pointed toward the cistern. The lid had been cut open clean along the weld seam edges, rusted but intact, as if someone long ago had done the job to last. Inside was water, not much, a few inches maybe, and something pale caught in the piping. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing, a jawbone small white against the iron. By sundown, the site was a flood of motion deputies marking grids, evidence techs, laying tarps. I stepped back and watched as they pulled out the first bundle of remains, tiny as a bird skeleton, then another and another. 5 in total by nightfall. 5 small lives sealed in the ground all this time, while the world above went on pretending. I knelt beside the rim of that cistern and ran my gloved hand along the inside wall. The stone felt cold, older than it should have been for a farm well. The smell rose heavy, wet limestone and something sweeter, almost floral, like decay, trying to disguise itself. When they finished for the night, I stayed behind while the lights hummed and the air thickened with the coming storm. I looked across the field where the children had last been seen running. The grass moved in slow waves, the same as it had 41 years ago. I could almost hear their laughter on the wind, that high, wild sound that used to mean nothing but joy. Somewhere beneath that sound, I thought I heard something else, a faint squeak from the plumbing maybe, or air forcing its way through an old line. Jacob had mentioned it earlier, said it almost sounded like a whisper. I told him it was probably pressure, just the house settling, but the truth is I wasn't sure. Back at the command post, I found the old Carter file laid open on the table, pages yellowed typewriter ink faint. Sheriff Halpern's notes ran in blue pen down the margins. One line caught my eye. Cistern sealed, 1974. No visible access. The name beside the permit was Samuel Carter. My father's initials appeared on the inspection line, neat and deliberate, the way he always wrote them. I stared at those 2 signatures until the letters blurred. He'd told me once that out here a man's word was as good as any seal. I never imagined his word might have been welded into one. The storm broke sometime after midnight, hard rain on tin wind clawing through the open barn slats. I watched it from my truck headlights off the field, silvered in lightning. The old cistern sat under a flood tarp, water running down its sides in sheets. For the first time in years, the land around the Carter farm looked alive again, awake, restless, unwilling to stay quiet any longer. I closed my eyes and thought of Bertie still setting 5 plates every Sunday, waiting for the sound of the porch door that never came. And as thunder rolled across Split Creek, I realized this wasn't just a discovery. It was the ground finally telling us what it had been forced to hold. Some stories start with a scream. This one started with silence, but it was about to find its voice. The storm passed by morning, leaving the Carter farm wrapped in a strange quiet, the kind that comes after too much noise. The rain had turned the clay soil into slick red paste, and every bootstep left its memory behind. I stood near the old cistern, the tarp still tied down with ropes, the yellow tape fluttering in a slow wind that smelled of wet hay and rust. The ground crews were back at it early, kneeling in the mud, sorting soil with brushes and screens, bagging fragments so small you could hold a life between 2 fingers. The light was flat gray and tired. When I got there, the university team had already uncovered another partial skeleton beneath the first layer. They said it was older, different decomposition, different soil compaction. And just like that, the question that had been waiting behind every conversation finally spoke. What else was down there? I walked the perimeter, slowly, eyes scanning the barn, the fence line, the path that led out to the dry creek. Every piece of this land carried the weight of repetition. Things had been buried here before. It wasn't guesswork anymore, it was pattern. I caught sight of a young technician named Reyes bent over a clipboard, her gloves stained dark. She looked up when she saw me and said, "Detective, it's not just the 5. We've got 6, maybe more. And the fabric, none of it's newer than the early 80s. I crouched beside her. There was a tiny shoe, half decayed a doll's head, with the eyes gone cloudy and bits of patterned cloth that might have once been a child's nightgown. The smell was faint but distinct earth that had held on too long. Inside the barn, the air was damp and close. Someone had dragged in tables and lighting for a makeshift command post. On the center table lay the old Carter file, its folder swollen with age edges, softened like an old Bible. Sheriff Hargrove was there, glasses halfway down his nose, turning pages like they were about to break apart. He didn't look up until I spoke. "You ever meet Samuel Carter?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Once," he said, "back when I was a rookie. He came in to file a permit to seal the cistern, said the water went bad. Never saw him again after that." He flipped the page toward me. The date read 1974. My father's signature was at the bottom. That moment sat heavy between us. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Your dad ever mentioned this job?" I shook my head. "No. But he doesn't forget much. I'll ask him." When I stepped back outside, the wind had picked up. It carried the smell of the field-damp grass and motor oil from the backhoe parked by the fence. One of the deputies called out from the feed room behind the barn. "Detective, you need to see this." I followed his voice to a set of floorboards that had been pried up. Beneath them was a line of old plumbing, corroded pipes branching out like veins, one capped and welded shut with a newer PVC line spliced into it. I traced the connection with my flashlight, the beam catching the thin white curve of the pipe that ran straight under the feed trough. "What's it for?" I asked. The deputy shrugged. "Trillo. The plumber said that's what backed up the system. He thought it was air in the line, but when he ran pressure tests, it made noise, like something pushing back." That night I drove out to see Jacob Trillo at his place on the edge of town. His yard was small, a single live oak leaning over a gravel drive. He opened the door before I even knocked twice. His face was drawn tight like he hadn't slept. He waved me in, but stayed standing near the window. I didn't know what I was looking at. He said, voice low. When I opened that line, I thought maybe a raccoon got in or a nest, but it didn't look right. And that sound, it wasn't a pipe thing. I asked him to explain. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. It was like air was trying to talk. You know how water moves when a drain gurgles? It was that, but softer, like a whisper caught under the water. You couldn't make out words, but it was there. He caught himself embarrassed. I know how it sounds, but that's the truth. I thanked him and left him to his silence. Back at the motel, I spread the photos across the bed. 5 skulls bits of fabric, the blue scrap that might have been part of Caleb's toy dog. There was also 1 set of bones that didn't match any of the Carter kids, different size older. That detail sat like a stone in my chest. I pulled the original file toward me again and read through the typed statements. Halpern's handwriting in the margins was shaky but neat. He'd written, "No sign of struggle. No blood, no scent trail past the cistern. Case presumed lost." He'd circled 1 word unfounded and underlined it twice. That word stung now. There was nothing unfounded about what lay beneath that ground. By midweek, the excavation had turned into a full-scale operation. Archaeologists worked beside forensic techs, each brushing away dirt that hid decades of secrets. Around noon, one of them called out. They'd found something metal buried near the lowest layer, a box about the size of a toolbox, rusted nearly through, but still intact. I dropped to my knees as they lifted it out, the soil around it sticking like clay. When the lid cracked open, the smell hit first iron and old oil. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas sealed with brittle tape. They cut it slowly, layer by layer, until the contents came clear, a pocket knife with the initials SC. Carved into the hilt, a Polaroid photograph of children standing beside the barn with their eyes scratched out and a small notebook. The first line read, July 11th, 1974. It's done. No one will ever find them. I read that line twice, maybe 3 times before closing the book. The sun was low by the time I stepped outside again. The light hit the barn in long gold streaks, and the air had cooled just enough to carry the smell of wet earth. I walked toward the cistern, still half covered by tarps, and tried to picture Samuel Carter sealing it all those years ago. What he thought about when he poured the concrete, when he welded that plate shut. Was he praying, regretting, or just working with the steady calm of a man finishing something he believed was right? The wind tugged at the tape around the dig site, making it snap and twist. For a second, it sounded almost like breathing. I drove back into town and parked in front of the Split Creek Public Records Office, a squat brick building that still smelled like mildew and carbon paper. Inside, the clerk handed me boxes labeled 1970s Permits Rural. I dug through until I found it permit number 88734, signed by Samuel Carter, co-signed by Lel Vance. Notes said inspection waived, sealing approved, and bacterial contamination. No mention of what was inside. My father's name sat there in black ink, a small piece of handwriting that felt heavier than the rest. When I got to his house that night, the porch light was already on. He was sitting out there, boots crossed, bottle of bourbon on the step. He didn't look surprised to see me. "I knew you'd come sooner or later," he said. I sat beside him. The crickets filled the pause. "I asked about the permit, the seal, the waiver." He rubbed his jaw. "I remember it," he said finally. "Sam asked me to sign. Said the water turned bad and he wanted it closed before one of the kids fell in. I wasn't supposed to check it, just sign off." He stared out at the dark yard. "He paid me $50 and a bottle of Glenlivet. That was worth something back then. I asked if he'd seen what was inside before they sealed it. He shook his head. He wouldn't let me look. I figured it was animal remains, maybe a calf, something foul. He looked spooked, though. Not scared, just guilty, maybe. But I didn't ask." He took a long drink. "When those kids went missing, I thought about it every night for a year. Then I stopped. Now here you are, proving I should have never stopped. I drove home in the dark, the radio off the road, slick under the tires. The moon hung low over the fields, wide and pale the way it does when the heat breaks. I kept seeing my father's face in the porch light, his eyes old and sharp, the kind that don't lie but still hold back more than they say. By the time I reached the motel, the crickets had quieted. I sat in the truck for a long time before getting out, watching the headlights catch the rain puddles in the gravel lot. Every reflection looked like another open eye. The next morning, the team found another layer beneath the last older still. The soil was packed tighter, darker like it had settled for half a century. When the brushes cleared a corner, faint lines appeared, curves intersecting circles, marks pressed into the earth by something heavy. "It's not natural," the anthropologist said. "Could be a container, a barrel maybe?" I knelt beside him and traced the pattern with a gloved finger. It felt deliberate, the kind of thing you do when you're trying to mark a place for good. I thought about the children who vanished before the Carters, the names that had drifted through old missing person files from the 60s. I'd seen them once back when the database was new. I never thought they'd tie here. But now, standing over that marked earth, I couldn't shake the sense that Split Creek's ghosts weren't limited to one family. The day ended with more questions than answers, but the line was clear now. Samuel Carter hadn't just buried his grandchildren. He'd started something long before them, something Laird planned, maybe even believed in. I stood by the fence before leaving the last light burning out over the pasture. The breeze carried the faintest sound of the tarp shifting over the pit. It almost sounded like the ground exhaling again. I turned off my flashlight, let my eyes adjust to the dark, and whispered without meaning to, "What did you do?" "Sam?" The air didn't answer, but it felt heavier for having asked. By the time I climbed into my truck, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever we'd uncovered wasn't finished talking. I didn't sleep that night. The motel clock clicked past every hour like it was counting something I didn't want to finish. Around 4, I gave up trying, pulled on my boots, and drove back to the farm. The road was still damp from the rain, and mist hung low over the pastures. The tarps around the excavation site glistened silver under the floodlights we'd left running overnight. I cut the engine and just sat there for a moment, the windshield fogging as I tried to get my head around it. All the layers, the artifacts, the pattern that kept deepening. I'd spent most of my life chasing the kinds of truths that hide in the cracks between people's words. But this was different. This felt like something that had been fed and kept alive by silence itself. I walked to the dig site and stood over the cistern. The air was heavy and smelled like wet stone. A night deputy, a kid not much older than 20, was sitting in the truck with the heater on. When he saw me, he stepped out, straightened his jacket, and said, "Morning, ma'am." His voice had that half-sleep roughness in it. "Anything happen overnight?" I asked. He shook his head, but added, "Heard something strange about an hour ago. Sounded like scraping metal on stone, maybe wind through the pipe. I didn't want to mess with it." I nodded, told him he did right. Sometimes the best thing you can do in the dark is nothing. By sunrise, the crew was back. The ground still shined with dew, and every shovel strike echoed like a heartbeat. The forensic-led doctor, Mott, called me over mid-morning. He was kneeling beside the open trench mud up to his knees, face drawn with fatigue. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing me a pair of gloves. He gestured toward the bottom layer they'd reached, smooth, deliberate, almost like tile. It wasn't stone, though. It was wood. Long planks burned black on the edges, fitted tight together. The anthropologist brushed away more soil until carvings started to show circles, overlapping in spirals patterns too consistent to be random. "This isn't natural," he said quietly. "Somebody built this." We pried one of the boards loose. Underneath was a cavity dry and lined with something that looked like old tar paper. Inside lay bones smaller than the rest, brittle and yellowed with age. Mott studied them for a long time before saying, "Pre-1950s, maybe older." That was when I realized the Carters weren't the start of anything. They were just the last entry in a book that had been writing itself for decades. After lunch, I drove to the county archives. The woman at the desk remembered me from earlier in the week. Back again, she asked. I told her I was looking for any property records tied to the Carters before 1950. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a box marked Deeds and Transfers, Caldwell County. Inside were stacks of brittle paper tied with string. The earliest deed for the Carter property dated 1923. Under purpose of use, someone had handwritten agricultural and spiritual retreat. That stopped me. Below that was a note in red pencil. Circle 12, charter dissolved 1936. I asked her what Circle 12 meant. She frowned. Never heard of it. Sounds like one of those farm co-ops, maybe a religious one. But her tone said she didn't quite believe it. Back at the office, I ran the phrase through our database. It wasn't much, just a couple of old regional references, some kind of offshoot congregation that practiced earth renewal rituals founded by a man named Amos Carter in the early 1900s. His descendants included Samuel. There were hints of gatherings of families moving between properties under different names, always near wells pits or natural springs. I leaned back in my chair, the pieces forming something I didn't want to see. The Chosen Five Samuel's notebook had said. It wasn't just poetry, it was lineage. When I got home that night, I called my father. He didn't answer, which wasn't unusual for him. I left a message saying we needed to talk, but an hour later, his truck pulled into my driveway. He came inside without knocking, sat at the table, and said, "You went to the archives." His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, an old kind of dread. I nodded. "You signed that cistern permit," I said. "You saw the symbol on the form, the circles." He looked down at his hands. I didn't think they'd mean anything anymore. When I asked what they was, he took a slow breath and said, "My daddy told me once, long before any of this, that Samuel Carter's people used to hold gatherings out by the spring. They'd light fires, sing low, and talk about keeping balance with the land. Folks called them the Circle. Nobody said much because they minded their own and didn't cause trouble, at least not that anyone saw. When the drought hit in 36, most of them moved away or died off. But Sam, he stayed. Some said he was still keeping the old ways. Others said he'd gone off the rails." My father's voice went quiet. "I thought it was just stories. I didn't think—" He didn't finish. The next morning, we brought in ground-penetrating radar. The readings lit up like fireworks, 12 evenly spaced pits under the back pasture, each sealed and layered the same way. 12 circles. It hit me all at once. The notebook's date, 1974, wasn't the first or the last. It was part of a sequence. Bertie must have known. She'd lived on that land for decades after Samuel died. She'd watched the fields, probably heard the whispers, seen the marks on the trees. The thought made my stomach turn. We opened the first pit that afternoon. Inside, under layers of soil and timber, were 3 sets of remains. Not children this time, adults. The bones were arranged carefully, hands folded over chests, heads turned east. The same symbols were carved into the wood above them. I felt the air shift around us, the kind of pressure change you get before a storm. Mott muttered, "He wasn't just burying. He was performing something." Later in Bertie's house, we found the rest of the truth waiting in plain sight. Her bedroom walls were lined with framed photos, faces of the missing from nearby counties, all clipped from old newspapers. I'd thought they were memorials at first, but behind each frame was a sheet of lined paper handwritten in her careful cursive. 5 returned to the earth. 5 kept in balance. 5 remembered. It read like a ledger, each note dated years apart. On her nightstand was a leather-bound journal newer than the rest. Inside were daily entries written in shaky script. The last one, dated March 1st, 2024, said, "They will come for the last circle soon. The soil won't rest until it's complete." My hands went cold as I read it. We sent the evidence to forensics and expanded the search to the surrounding counties. The FBI stepped in once the historical angle became clear. They matched missing persons reports from the 1950s through the early 80s, 42 in total, to the remains we'd found. And every site connected in one way or another to property once owned or leased by someone in the Carter bloodline. But the part that kept me up at night came later that week. A librarian from Montgomery County called to say a man had come in asking for local genealogy records under the name Circle 12. He'd left behind a return address in Alabama. The name on the request form was Thomas Carter, Bertie's surviving son. The next morning, I drove out to my father's again. He was on the porch, same spot, same bottle. "You knew about Thomas," I said. He nodded. "He came by once after Bertie's funeral. Asked about old maps, said he was writing a book about family history." I didn't think much of it. His eyes met mine. "Is he part of this?" I said. Nothing, just handed him a copy of Bertie's last journal entry. He read it twice, jaw tightening. "Then he's not writing a book," he said softly. We got the warrant 2 days later. A small property along the Sabine River listed under an alias but paid for with a trust connected to Bertie's estate. The house sat half sunk into the woods, its windows covered in plywood, the yard littered with burned candles and bones of small animals. Inside, the smell of mildew hit first, then something sharper rot masked by sage and oil. Maps lined the walls marked with circles and numbers, each corresponding to known burial sites. In the center of the room was an open journal written in Thomas's hand. The 12th circle, it read. 4 chosen, 1 to go. Out back near the riverbank, we found evidence of a campsite, 5 logs arranged in a star, melted wax bits of cloth. The prints were fresh. And then, under the old boathouse, a trap door leading down into limestone. The air that came up was cool and damp, carrying the smell of earth and old iron. We followed it with flashlights. The path narrowed into a cave, walls smooth and cold under our hands. At the far end, half hidden by shadows, stood Thomas Carter. His hair hung to his shoulders, his face streaked with dirt. He was holding something what looked like a burlap sack, and for a second I thought it was supplies. Then it moved. I raised my weapon, told him to drop it. He didn't. He looked straight at me, calm as a man finishing a sentence, and said, "They're waiting for the last one. It has to be complete." His voice was cracked, almost reverent. I took a step closer. "What's in the bag?" "Thomas." He smiled a hollow, broken kind of smile and said, "Balance." Then he let the sack fall open. Inside was a child, alive but unconscious. Dirt streaked across her face. We rushed forward, pulled her out, checked for pulse and breath. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. Thomas didn't resist when we cuffed him. He just whispered, "It's done now," and let his head fall forward. When we led him out, the first light of dawn was cutting through the trees. The river moved slow beside us, carrying leaves and bits of ash. I stood there for a long time, watching it flow, the air cool on my face, the smell of pine and damp earth filling the morning. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore, just tired. For the first time, the ground beneath Split Creek felt like it might finally rest. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the thought that some stories don't end when the last secret's uncovered. Some just go quiet for a while, waiting for the next voice, willing to listen. The drive back from the Sabine River that morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows when the adrenaline's gone, and all that's left is the hum of tires on wet pavement. The child we'd pulled from Thomas Carter's hands slept in the back seat of the medic's truck ahead of me, small and still but breathing. She had dirt in her hair and a bruise along her jaw, and when the paramedic covered her with a blanket, she didn't stir. It should have felt like victory, but all I could think about was how deep the roots of this thing had gone, how far into the soil those circles stretched. The air outside smelled like pine and ash. I rolled the window down anyway. I needed to breathe something real. By the time we reached town, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the fog. Reporters had gathered at the sheriff's office, cameras pointed at the steps, but nobody said a word when we walked in. Even they seemed to know this wasn't a story for noise. Thomas was booked quietly. No spectacle, no shouting. He sat in the holding room with his hands folded, eyes on the wall. When I went in to take his statement, he didn't look up. His wrists were raw where the cuffs had rubbed them. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, without prompting, he said, "You think you stopped it?" His voice was soft, like he was talking to himself. But it stopped long before I was born. We were just keeping the promise. I asked him what that meant, but he only smiled faintly and said, "The land remembers." He was transferred to federal custody that night. They found blood traces, children's belongings, and a set of journals in the cabin ritual descriptions. Old prayers and dates that matched missing persons reports across 4 states. It was enough to bury him in life sentences before the trial even began. But none of that brought the kids back. None of it could. The girl survived. Her name was Lily. She stayed at a recovery home near Dallas for a while before being placed with her aunt. The night I visited her in the hospital, she was sitting up coloring with a nurse. When I asked how she was feeling, she said, "The man told me he was fixing something that broke. I told her he was wrong." She didn't answer, just kept coloring. There was a calmness to her that didn't belong to a child, the kind you only see in people who've already met the worst of the world. The dig sites were closed up one by one over the next month. The remains that could be identified were sent home to families who had been waiting half a lifetime for an answer. Others, those who had no records, no names left, were buried together under a single memorial marker on what had once been the Carter farm. The land was cleared, fenced, and later turned into a field of wildflowers by local volunteers. No one calls it farmland anymore. They call it the quiet field. I stood there the day they unveiled the memorial stone. It was simple gray granite, 5 circles etched into the surface, their lines intertwined like roots. Beneath it, a plaque read, "For those who were taken and those who came looking." It wasn't much, but it was honest. Bertie's house had long since been torn down. The wood burned, the ashes buried in a pit sealed with concrete. Some said it was superstition, others called it cleansing. To me, it felt like both. My father came that day too. He walked slow, leaning heavier on his cane than he liked to admit. We stood side by side without saying much. He hadn't been well since the investigation. Guilt does strange things to a man. It eats him from the inside, quiet and steady. Before we left, he put his hand on the stone and said, "We all signed something we didn't understand." Then he turned and walked back toward the truck. He died that winter, heart failure in his sleep. I found his survey maps neatly rolled up on the desk, a note pinned to them that read, "The lines we draw don't always stay where we put them." The trial for Thomas Carter took less than 6 weeks. The prosecution didn't need to convince anyone. The evidence spoke louder than any testimony could. His confession covered everything: how Samuel had raised him to believe the circle's preserved balance, how Bertie carried the rituals forward under the guise of family duty, how every missing child was meant to complete a pattern that had begun before the Depression. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, he didn't react. He just sat there, hands clasped, lips moving in what looked like prayer. He's serving 5 consecutive life sentences now in a federal facility out of state. The doctors say he spends most days in silence. When the investigation closed, I kept one thing from the evidence room: Samuel's pocket knife. The initials on the handle had worn down from handling, but the blade still caught the light, sharp and clean. I didn't take it as a souvenir. I took it because I couldn't let it sit in a box marked historical artifact. Too much blood, too many hands had passed it along. Some things don't belong in archives, they belong buried, but on your own terms. One evening, just after sunset, I walked to the edge of the quiet field, dug a hole near the oak tree that had survived every storm, and buried it there. The dirt was soft, almost forgiving. The town changed after that, though not in the ways people might expect. Split Creek didn't rebuild so much as it learned how to live with its ghosts. Folks still drive past the field, but they slow down now. Someone leaves flowers there every spring, always yellow daisies. The school started a scholarship fund in the Carter's name, not for remembrance of tragedy, but for community service. The first recipient was a young girl who said she wanted to study archaeology because the earth keeps secrets and someone has to listen. Sometimes I go out there in the evenings when the air cools and the sky turns that faded orange that only Texas gets right. I'll park by the fence and just sit with the sound of the crickets. It's strange how something so small can fill up all that space. Every so often I think I hear laughter light, distant like kids playing in the tall grass. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's mercy. I don't try to decide which. It's been a year now since the case closed. I still get letters from families asking if any of the unidentified remains could be theirs. I answer each one personally. You don't send form letters for that kind of grief. The truth is, not all questions find answers, and not all names get spoken again. But silence doesn't mean they're forgotten. It just means the story's resting for a while. People sometimes ask if I believe in evil after everything I've seen. I tell them no, not the kind they mean. What I've learned is that evil rarely looks like monsters. It looks like fear handed down, ritualized, justified, until nobody remembers how it started. It looks like a family convincing itself that darkness is duty. What breaks that chain isn't punishment. It's someone finally saying, no more. When I think of the Carter children now, I don't picture bones or crime scenes. I picture them running across the field that morning in 1983, barefoot and free, the sun on their backs, their laughter chasing the wind. That's how they deserve to be remembered, not as part of some man's belief, but as the joy that place once held before silence swallowed it whole. A few months ago, the last of the tarps came down from the site. The grass had already grown over most of the scars. The air felt different, lighter maybe. When I knelt to read the names on the memorial, I noticed something small caught in the grass, a piece of blue fabric frayed but still bright. For a second, I thought about Caleb and his stuffed dog, the one we'd found near the cistern all those years ago. I picked it up, brushed off the dirt, and tucked it into my pocket. I don't know why. Maybe it's a reminder, maybe it's penance, but I carry it now. Some things you just keep close so they don't get lost again. Every so often, when the cases pile up and the nights stretch too long, I'll drive past the quiet field on my way home. The wind moves through the grass like breath, steady and patient. It reminds me that what's buried isn't always gone. It's just waiting for someone to listen. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for headlines, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Remember them when you pass a field in the quiet, when the air feels too still and the world feels too ordinary to hold something so heavy. Because somewhere under that silence, there's always a story that still remembers being heard.